The glass walls caught the city lights like a mirror of 1,000 watching eyes as Ethan Cole's voice cut through the boardroom with surgical precision. Your position is no longer required. The words didn't echo, they landed, flat, final, irreversible. And for a second, even the quiet hum of the HVAC system seemed to pull back as if the building itself understood something had just shifted. Amara Brooks didn't move right away. She stood at the far end of the polished walnut table, tablet in hand, posture straight, expression composed in a way that didn't match the weight of what had just been said. Around her, 12 executives sat frozen in their leather chairs, their reflections faintly visible in the glass walls that framed the skyline of downtown Chicago, phones half lowered, eyes flicking between Ethan and the woman who had quietly held the entire machine together for years without ever asking for credit. Ethan didn't look at her again after delivering the decision. He reached for the folder in front of him, flipping it shut with the same efficiency he used to close million-dollar deals, his cufflink catching a shard of light as his wrist moved, the gesture small but absolute. HR will handle the transition, he added, already shifting his attention to the next agenda item as if she were no longer part of the room. But she was still there, still standing, still breathing, and in that brief pause, no longer than a heartbeat, the air changed. Amara placed her tablet gently on the table, aligning it perfectly with the edge as she always did, a habit born from years of managing chaos with quiet precision. And when she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, clear and steady, threading through the silence without resistance. Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Cole. No tremor, no hesitation, just a sentence delivered with the same professionalism she had brought to every 2 a.m. crisis, every last-minute pivot, every impossible deadline she had turned into success without ever stepping into the spotlight. A few heads shifted, a couple of the younger analysts exchanged quick glances, confusion flickering across their faces because loyalty wasn't supposed to end like this, not in a room where loyalty had always been quietly exploited and rarely acknowledged. Ethan gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that dismissed rather than acknowledged, and that was it. No explanation, no justification, just the clean execution of a decision that only he had the authority to make. Amara picked up her bag, the soft leather folding under her fingers, and turned toward the door, her heels clicking once, twice, each step measured, controlled, as if the weight of the room had no claim on her. But as she reached the glass door, her hand resting briefly on the cold metal handle, she paused, not long enough to invite attention, just long enough for something unspoken to settle, and she turned her head slightly, her gaze landing on Ethan for the first time since he had spoken. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't hurt. It was something quieter, something that carried the weight of knowledge he didn't have yet. You won't remember this moment, she said, her voice softer now, almost private despite the room full of witnesses, but you should. The sentence hung there, suspended in the air between them, and for the first time, Ethan's eyes lifted fully to meet hers, a flicker of something. Irritation, curiosity, maybe the faintest trace of unease, passing through his otherwise controlled expression. But he didn't respond. He never did when something didn't fit neatly into his framework of logic and control. Amara didn't wait for a reply. She opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, the sound of the boardroom sealing behind her with a soft click that felt louder than it should have, like a line drawn between two versions of reality. The corridor outside was quieter, the lighting softer, the tension diffused into the muted rhythm of office life, continuing as if nothing had happened, as if a cornerstone hadn't just been removed from the foundation. She walked past the reception desk, past the rows of workstations where conversations dipped into whispers as she passed, her name moving through the air in fragments she didn't bother to catch, because none of it mattered now. What mattered was the steady beat of her own breath, the controlled pace of her steps, the way her hand moved almost instinctively to rest just below her ribcage, fingers pressing lightly against the fabric of her blouse in a gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. But it wasn't nothing. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet chime, and she stepped inside, turning to face the mirrored wall as the doors closed, sealing her into a small, reflective box where the version of herself she had maintained for years finally had space to shift. Her shoulders lowered just slightly, the tension easing by degrees rather than breaking, because she had never been the kind of person who collapsed under pressure. The reflection looking back at her was the same one everyone in that boardroom had seen. Composed, capable, unshaken. But there was something new in her eyes now, something deeper, steadier, like a decision that had already been made long before this moment arrived. The elevator began its descent, the numbers lighting up one by one, and with each passing floor, the distance between her and that boardroom grew, not just physically, but in every way that mattered. Above, Ethan had already moved on to the next topic, his voice resuming its measured cadence, the room falling back into rhythm as if the disruption had been nothing more than a brief interruption. But the rhythm wasn't the same, not really. There were gaps now, subtle at first, almost invisible, the kind you only noticed if you knew exactly how things were supposed to flow. A report slightly out of order, a calendar overlap that shouldn't exist, a hesitation in the response from someone who used to anticipate every need before it was spoken. Ethan noticed, of course he did. He noticed everything, but he didn't connect it. Not yet, because in his world, systems were interchangeable, people were replaceable, and control was absolute. He adjusted his watch, the polished face catching the overhead light, and continued speaking, unaware that the precision he relied on had just lost its quiet architect. Down in the elevator, Amara closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in defeat, but in recalibration, her hand still resting where it had settled, her breath steady, her posture unbroken. The doors opened to the lobby, the late afternoon sun spilling through the glass entrance in long, golden lines that stretched across the marble floor, and she stepped out into it without hesitation, the light catching her face in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the city itself were marking the moment. She didn't look back. Not at the elevator, not at the floors above, not at the life she had just walked away from. Because some exits aren't about leaving something behind. They're about carrying something forward that no one else can see yet. And somewhere, in the quiet space beneath her steady breath, a truth moved with her, silent, undeniable, and waiting for the moment it would no longer need to be hidden. The first sign that something was off did not come as a failure, but as a delay, a 3-minute gap in a schedule that had never tolerated even 30 seconds of drift, and Ethan Cole noticed at the moment his assistant hesitated outside his office door, tablet in hand, eyes scanning a calendar that should have been seamless. He did not look up immediately, his attention still on the contract spread across his desk, but the silence stretched just a fraction too long, and that was enough. "What is it?" he asked, his tone even, controlled. The same tone he used in boardrooms when numbers did not align. "There is a conflict with the Henderson call," the new assistant said, her voice careful, measured in a way that suggested she was already aware she was stepping into a gap she did not fully understand. Ethan's pen paused mid-signature. "There are no conflicts on my calendar," he replied, not as a question, but as a correction. The assistant swallowed lightly, tapping her screen. It was adjusted this morning, but the update did not sync with the executive team. Ethan leaned back slowly, the leather chair giving a soft creak under his weight, and for the first time that morning, he looked at her fully, his gaze sharp, assessing. "It should have been handled before it became visible," he said, and while the words were directed at her, the irritation behind them was not entirely hers to carry. Because there had never been visible gaps before. Not when Amara Brooks had been the one managing the invisible architecture of his days, anticipating collisions before they formed, smoothing over disruptions before they had a chance to exist. The assistant nodded quickly, already moving to correct the error, but the moment lingered, small and quiet, yet undeniably present. Ethan returned his attention to the contract, finishing the signature with precise strokes. But the rhythm was different now, the flow interrupted in a way that felt unfamiliar, like a machine running without a critical part it had always assumed would be there. The day continued, meeting after meeting, decision after decision, but the edges were rougher than they should have been, details requiring his direct input that had once been resolved before they ever reached his desk. A briefing document arrived with a section missing. A follow-up email went unanswered for longer than acceptable. A client request had to be clarified twice instead of once, and each time, Ethan felt it, not as a major disruption, but as a series of minor fractures that accumulated into something harder to ignore. By mid-afternoon, the tension had settled into his shoulders, subtle but persistent. And when he finally dismissed the last meeting of the day, the boardroom emptying with the soft shuffle of departing executives, he remained seated for a moment longer than usual, his gaze drifting to the far end of the table where she had stood just days ago. The memory was not vivid, not emotional, just a snapshot of a moment he had already categorized and moved past, or at least that was what he had told himself. But her last words surfaced now, uninvited, quiet but precise. "You will not remember this moment, but you should." Ethan exhaled slowly, dismissing the thought as quickly as it had appeared, because reflection was not a habit he indulged in, not when there were systems to maintain and outcomes to secure. He stood, straightening his jacket with a practiced motion, and stepped out into the hallway, the office around him still active, still efficient, still functioning. On the surface, nothing had changed, but systems did not break all at once. They shifted, adjusted, compensated, and sometimes they revealed their weaknesses only after the person who held them together was no longer there. The following week brought the first real consequence, though it did not announce itself as such. It came in the form of a presentation, a high-stakes pitch to a client that had taken months to develop, one that Amara had quietly refined behind the scenes, shaping the narrative, aligning the data, ensuring that every transition flowed seamlessly into the next. Without her, the presentation still existed, the slides were still there, the numbers still accurate, but the cohesion was missing, the subtle thread that connected everything into a compelling story. Ethan stood at the front of the room, delivering the pitch with his usual confidence, his voice steady, his presence commanding, but he felt it, the slight disconnect in the pacing, the moments where the narrative should have tightened but instead drifted, the questions from the client that came a beat earlier than expected, exposing gaps that should have been anticipated. He adjusted in real time, compensating with experience and authority, but when the meeting ended and the client's response was polite rather than decisive, he knew. Not failure, not yet, but not success either. And in his world, anything less than success was a signal. Back in his office, he reviewed the materials again, scanning for errors, for oversights, for anything that could explain the shift, but the documents were technically sound. The problem was not in what was there. It was in what was missing. His gaze moved to his inbox, scrolling through the threads, the revisions, the notes, and then he saw it, buried in the timeline, an unsent draft, the subject line marked but the message never delivered. He opened it without hesitation, his eyes moving quickly over the text, and for the first time in days, something held his attention completely. The email was structured the way she always structured them, clear, precise, each point building on the last. But there was a difference, a tone that was more direct than usual, less filtered, as if it had been written in a moment, where restraint had finally given way to truth. It outlined concerns about the direction of the Henderson deal, the risks that had not been fully accounted for, the adjustments that needed to be made to maintain control of the outcome. It was not criticism. It was clarity, and it had never been sent. Ethan sat back slowly, the screen casting a faint glow across his face as he read it again, more carefully this time, absorbing not just the content, but the implication. She had seen it before he did. She had always seen it before he did. And now, without her, the system was reacting instead of anticipating, adjusting instead of leading. He closed the email, but the words did not leave with it. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm, traffic flowing, lights shifting, the world continuing without pause. But inside that office, something had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. Ethan reached for his phone, his thumb hovering briefly over the screen as if considering something he could not quite define, and then he set it back down, the motion deliberate, controlled. Because reaching out would mean acknowledging something he was not ready to name. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern continued, small disruptions accumulating into measurable impact. A deal delayed here. A negotiation extended there. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to register, enough for the board to start asking questions in the measured, indirect way they always did. Ethan answered them with the same confidence he always had, presenting data, outlining strategies, maintaining the image of control that had defined his leadership from the beginning. But beneath that surface, the absence remained, quiet, persistent, undeniable. And somewhere beyond the reach of his carefully managed world, Amara Brooks was no longer part of the system he controlled, no longer bound by the structure he had built, moving forward on a path he had not considered, carrying with her a truth that had yet to intersect with his again, but would, in time, in a way that would not ask for his permission. The first real crack did not come from a boardroom or a client, but from silence, the kind that lingers just a second too long on a phone call when a deal should be closing, the kind that makes seasoned investors glance at each other without saying a word, and Ethan Cole recognized it immediately even if he did not name it out loud. The conference line had gone still after his final statement, the terms laid out with his usual precision, his voice steady, confident, controlled, but the response on the other end was delayed, not with hesitation, but with calculation, and that difference mattered. "We will need time to review," the client finally said, their tone polite, professional, but distant in a way that had not been there before. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk, his expression unchanged, but something in his chest tightened, not sharply, just enough to register. "Of course," he replied, his voice even. "I will have my team follow up with any additional data you require." The call ended with the usual formalities, but when the line went dead, the quiet in his office felt heavier than it should have. He did not move right away. The skyline outside his window stretched wide under a pale afternoon light, cars moving like distant currents far below, the city operating with its usual rhythm, but inside that glass office, the rhythm was off, just slightly, just enough to disrupt the seamless flow he had built his reputation on. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, and walked to the window, his reflection faintly visible against the glass, superimposed over the city he had learned to navigate with absolute control. Control, that had always been the constant. But control was not something you noticed when it was intact. You noticed it when it began to slip in ways that could not be immediately corrected. Behind him, his phone buzzed once, then again, notifications stacking in a pattern that suggested urgency, but not crisis. Not yet. He turned back, picking up the device, scanning the messages with quick efficiency. A follow-up question from the Henderson team. A clarification request from legal. A reminder from finance about projections that needed revision. None of it was unusual on its own, but together they formed a pattern he could not ignore. These were the kinds of things that used to be resolved before they ever reached him, filtered, refined, handled with a precision so quiet it had become invisible. He set the phone down, his gaze drifting to his desk where the unsent email still sat in his mind, its words sharper now than they had been when he first read them. She had seen it before he did. The thought returned, uninvited, and this time, he did not push it away as quickly. Instead, he reached for his laptop, opening his inbox again, scrolling back through threads that had once felt routine, now carrying a different weight. There were patterns there, subtle but consistent, small adjustments she had made without announcement, decisions that had shifted outcomes before problems had fully formed. He had never asked how. He had never needed to. The system had worked, and in his world, results were the only measure that mattered. Until they were not. A knock at the door pulled him back to the present, and his new assistant stepped in, her posture careful, her expression composed but not entirely steady. "The board is requesting an update on the Henderson timeline," she said, holding her tablet close, as if it could anchor her in a role that still did not quite fit. Ethan nodded once, already moving toward his desk, his mind shifting into response mode, the place where he had always been strongest. "Schedule it for tomorrow morning," he said, his voice firm, decisive. "I will present the revised strategy." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded and stepped back out, the door closing softly behind her. Ethan sat down, pulling the relevant documents toward him, his focus narrowing, his thoughts aligning into a structured plan. This was familiar territory. Adjustment, recalibration, execution. He had built his entire career on the ability to adapt under pressure, to turn instability into advantage. But as he reviewed the data, something felt different, not in the numbers themselves, but in the space between them, the missing connective tissue that turned information into strategy. He paused, his pen hovering above the page, and for a brief moment, the image of her standing at the end of the table surfaced again, not as a distraction, but as a reference point, a comparison his mind made without permission. "You will not remember this moment," but you should. The words settled deeper now, no longer dismissible, no longer abstract. Because he was remembering, not the moment itself, but what it represented, the absence that followed it. The next morning arrived with the same efficiency as every other, the office already active by the time Ethan stepped off the elevator, conversations low and focused, screens glowing with data, the entire environment structured around movement and output. He walked through it with his usual presence, measured, controlled, acknowledging only what was necessary, his attention already on the meeting ahead. The boardroom was prepared, documents arranged, screens ready, the atmosphere carrying the subtle weight of expectation that always accompanied these sessions. He took his seat at the head of the table, his posture straight, his expression composed, and began. The presentation unfolded with precision, each point delivered with clarity, each projection supported by data, his voice steady, authoritative, the kind of performance that had secured his position at the top of the company. But as he moved through the material, he felt it again, the slight misalignment, the moments where the narrative should have tightened but instead required explanation, the questions from the board that came sharper, more pointed than usual, exposing edges that should have been smoother. What is the contingency if the timeline extends another quarter? One of the board members asked, his tone neutral, but his eyes focused in a way that signaled concern. Ethan responded without hesitation, outlining alternatives, presenting options, maintaining the image of control that had always defined him. But the question lingered, not because he could not answer it, but because it had been asked at all. The meeting concluded without resolution, the board requesting further analysis, further refinement, the kind of response that did not signal failure, but did not confirm success either. As the room emptied, the quiet that followed felt heavier than usual, the kind that carried implication rather than relief. Ethan remained seated for a moment, his hands resting on the table, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to sit in that space without immediately moving to fill it. Because something had changed, not in a way that could be corrected with a single decision, but in a way that required acknowledgement before it could be addressed. And somewhere beyond the walls of that building, beyond the systems he had built and controlled, Amara Brooks was no longer an unseen force within his world, no longer a quiet architect behind his success, but something else entirely, something he had yet to fully understand, moving forward with a direction that no longer aligned with his own, carrying with her not just the absence he now felt, but a presence he had not yet faced, one that would not be managed, adjusted, or dismissed when it finally stood in front of him again. It was not the failure that unsettled Ethan Cole, but the pattern forming beneath it, the quiet accumulation of small misalignments that no longer corrected themselves. And by the third week, even the most disciplined parts of his system had begun to show strain in ways that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The morning light filtered through the glass walls of his office in thin, pale lines, casting reflections across the polished surfaces that once felt like control, but now felt like exposure, every detail visible, every flaw harder to ignore. Ethan stood at his desk reviewing a revised proposal, his eyes scanning each line with precision, but his focus fractured in subtle intervals, drawn not to what was written, but to what was missing between the lines. It was not data. It was not logic. It was something less tangible, something that had once existed without needing to be named. Behind him, the door opened with a soft knock, and his assistant stepped in, her movements careful, her presence still slightly out of rhythm with the pace he expected. "The Larson Group has requested an earlier review," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of another adjustment that should not have been necessary. Ethan did not turn immediately, his gaze still fixed on the document in front of him. "Reschedule," he replied, his tone controlled, but the word came faster than usual, sharper at the edges. "We need more time." There was a pause, brief but noticeable, before she responded. "They indicated they are considering other options if the timeline shifts again." Ethan's hand stilled against the paper, his fingers pressing slightly harder than intended, the faint sound of the page creasing under the pressure breaking the silence. That did not happen. Not under his leadership. Not when his timelines were involved. He turned then, slowly, his expression composed, but his eyes more focused than before. "They will not move," he said, less as reassurance and more as a statement he expected the world to follow. The assistant nodded, though something in her posture suggested uncertainty, and she stepped back out of the office, leaving the door to close softly behind her. Ethan remained still for a moment, the quiet settling around him in a way that felt heavier than it should have, the kind of quiet that carried questions rather than answers. He looked back down at the proposal, but the words no longer aligned with the certainty he was used to. Instead, they felt incomplete, like a structure missing its internal support, stable on the surface but vulnerable beneath. He set the document aside and moved toward the window, his reflection once again merging with the city beyond. A man who had built his reputation on precision, now standing in a moment where precision alone was no longer enough. The thought came again, not as a distraction, but as a recognition. She had never allowed it to get this far. Amara Brooks had never let a timeline slip, never allowed a client to feel uncertainty, never left a detail unresolved long enough to be noticed. She had operated in the space between decision and execution, the space Ethan had never needed to occupy because she had filled it so completely it had become invisible. Until now. His phone buzzed again, another message, another adjustment, another piece of the system requiring direct attention, and for the first time in years, the weight of it felt cumulative rather than controlled. He picked up the phone, scanning the notification, and then, without fully deciding to, he opened his contacts, his thumb hovering for a fraction of a second over a name he had not selected in weeks. He did not press it. Instead, he locked the screen and set the phone down, the motion deliberate, restrained, because reaching out would require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement would require something he had not yet allowed himself to confront. The day moved forward, but the rhythm remained uneven, each hour carrying small disruptions that required more of his attention than they should have. His focus pulled in multiple directions at once. The seamless control he once maintained now replaced by constant recalibration. By late afternoon, the office had quieted slightly, the earlier urgency settling into a steady hum, but Ethan remained at his desk, reviewing projections that should have aligned more cleanly than they did. A shadow moved across the glass wall as someone passed by, the reflection shifting momentarily, and for a brief second, it reminded him of the way she used to move through the office, not drawing attention, but shaping everything around her with quiet precision. He pushed the thought aside, returning his focus to the numbers, but the comparison had already been made. Across the city, in a smaller office that did not yet carry the weight of a corporate empire, Amara Brooks stood in front of a whiteboard covered in clean, deliberate handwriting, her fingers resting lightly against the edge as she reviewed the strategy laid out before her. The space was different from the one she had left behind, less polished, less expansive, but it carried something the other had not, something built not on inherited systems, but on intentional design. A laptop sat open on the table behind her, emails lined up in a structured sequence, each one addressed, each one moving a process forward without unnecessary delay. She moved through them with quiet efficiency, her focus steady, her decisions measured, the same precision she had once applied to someone else's world, now directed entirely toward her own. The late afternoon light filtered through the window, softer here, warmer, casting a different kind of reflection across the room, one that did not demand perfection, but supported growth. She paused for a moment, her hand instinctively resting just below her ribcage, the same subtle gesture that had followed her since the day she walked out of that boardroom. Her expression unchanged, but her awareness deeper, anchored by something that extended beyond strategy and structure. A notification appeared on her screen, a message from a potential client requesting a consultation, their tone curious, cautious, the kind of inquiry that marked the beginning of something not yet proven. She read it once, then again, her eyes narrowing slightly as she considered the opportunity, not with urgency, but with intention. She did not rush to respond. She never had. Instead, she reached for a notebook, writing a few lines in careful script, mapping out the approach before engaging, ensuring that every step would align before it was taken. It was the same discipline she had always carried, the same quiet control, but now it belonged entirely to her. Back in his office, Ethan closed the final document of the day, his shoulders settling slightly as the immediate demands eased, but the underlying tension remained. a constant presence he could no longer ignore. He stood, adjusting his jacket once more, the motion automatic, and glanced briefly at the empty space across his desk, a space that had once been filled with answers he had never needed to ask for. Now, it remained empty, and the absence was no longer invisible. It was defined, measurable, and growing. And somewhere beyond the reach of his control, the person who had once filled that space was building something that no longer depended on him, something that would not simply return when called, something that would stand on its own terms when the time came for their paths to cross again, not as employer and assistant, but as something entirely different, something he was not yet prepared to face but would not be able to avoid. The invitation arrived without urgency, but it carried weight. The moment Ethan Cole saw the sender's name, a clean, understated email from a firm he had never worked with directly but had heard mentioned more than once in the past few weeks, always in the same tone, measured, curious, and increasingly impressed. He opened it standing by his desk, the late evening light fading behind the skyline, his office dimmer now, reflections sharper against the glass as the city shifted from day into night. The message was concise, direct, requesting his presence at a private strategy summit, a gathering of executives and founders who had begun to reshape conversations in sectors that had once been predictable. It was not unusual for him to receive invitations, but this one felt different, not in what it said, but in what it implied. He read it once, then again, his expression unchanged, but something beneath it registering quietly, a shift in awareness he did not immediately define. Across the room, his assistant was finishing the last tasks of the day, her movements careful, deliberate, still learning the rhythm she had stepped into, still adjusting to expectations that had never been written down but had always been understood. Add it to the calendar, Ethan said, his voice steady, controlled, as he forwarded the email without looking up. She nodded, confirming the details, and within seconds, the event appeared in his schedule, another block of time in a structure that had begun to feel more reactive than intentional. The night stretched on, the office gradually emptying, the hum of activity fading into a quieter stillness, but Ethan remained, reviewing projections that no longer aligned as cleanly as they once had, his focus sharp but divided, his mind tracking multiple threads at once, each one requiring attention, none of them resolving as efficiently as they should have. By the time he left, the city had fully transitioned, lights glowing against the dark, traffic moving in steady lines below, the world continuing without pause, indifferent to the subtle shifts happening behind glass walls above it. The following days moved quickly, preparations for the summit layered on top of existing demands, his schedule tightening, his attention stretched, but his control intact on the surface, always intact on the surface. When the evening of the event arrived, the venue stood in the center of the city like a statement, a modern structure of steel and glass, its interior lit with a soft, controlled brightness that reflected off polished floors and mirrored surfaces, creating an atmosphere that felt both open and contained. Ethan stepped inside with the same presence he carried into every room, measured, composed, his posture straight, his expression neutral, acknowledging greetings with brief nods, his focus already scanning, assessing, cataloging. Conversations moved around him in low, confident tones, clusters of executives exchanging insights, founders outlining visions, the air filled with the kind of quiet ambition that did not need to announce itself. He moved through it with ease, engaging where necessary, listening more than speaking, his reputation preceding him in subtle ways, opening space without demand. And then, without warning, the rhythm shifted. It was not loud. It was not sudden. It was a change in attention, a subtle redirection of focus across the room, like a current adjusting course. Ethan felt it before he identified the cause, his gaze lifting instinctively, following the shift, and then he saw her. Amara Brooks entered without hesitation, her presence steady, grounded, the soft light catching the contours of her face in a way that did not seek attention but commanded it nonetheless. She wore confidence the way others wore status, naturally, without effort, without the need to prove it. Conversations did not stop, but they adjusted, voices lowering slightly, eyes tracking her movement with a recognition that had nothing to do with her past and everything to do with who she had become. Ethan did not move. For a moment, the space between them stretched, filled with everything that had not been said, everything that had changed without his permission. She was not the woman who had stood at the end of his boardroom table. That version of her had been contained within his system, defined by his structure. This version existed outside of it entirely. She walked with quiet precision, greeting a small group near the center of the room, her tone calm, assured, her presence integrated seamlessly into a space that should have required introduction but did not. A man beside her gestured as he spoke, his posture respectful, engaged, and Ethan recognized him, a founder whose recent growth had drawn attention across multiple sectors. They were not equals in the traditional sense. Not yet, but the distance was smaller than it should have been. Ethan took a step forward before he fully decided to, his movement deliberate, controlled, but driven by something that had shifted beyond calculation. He approached just as the conversation eased, the group opening slightly, and for the first time since she had walked out of his office, they stood within reach of each other again. Amara turned before he spoke, as if she had already registered his presence, her gaze meeting his without surprise, without hesitation. There was no tension in her expression, no trace of the weight that had once existed between them, just a calm acknowledgement, as if this moment had always been expected, simply arriving on its own time. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice even, respectful but not deferential, the balance precise, intentional. Ethan held her gaze, the familiar structure of control still present in his posture, but something beneath it less certain than before. "Amara," he replied, her name carrying a different weight now, one he could not ignore. The group around them shifted slightly, sensing the connection without understanding its depth, giving space without stepping away entirely. "I was not aware you would be here," he added, the statement neutral on the surface, but layered beneath with something closer to recognition than surprise. She inclined her head slightly, a small acknowledgement. "There are a lot of things you were not aware of," she said, her tone soft, not sharp, not accusatory, just factual, the truth delivered without force. The words settled between them, not as a challenge, but as a boundary, clear and defined. Ethan did not respond immediately. For the first time in a long time, he did not have a prepared answer, no immediate correction, no structured reply. Instead, he observed, taking in the details he had once overlooked, the steadiness in her posture, the clarity in her presence, the absence of anything that required his approval. "You built something," he said finally, his voice lower now, less performative, more direct. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once. "I continued something," she replied, the distinction subtle but significant, her words carrying layers he had not yet fully uncovered. Before he could respond, a small movement at her side drew his attention, and he looked down without thinking, his focus shifting in a way that felt instinctive rather than controlled. A child stood beside her, no more than 3 years old, his small hand resting lightly against her coat, his eyes lifting with quiet curiosity toward the man who had suddenly become the center of his attention. The world did not stop. The room did not react. But for Ethan, everything narrowed to that moment, to the unmistakable familiarity in the child's features, the shape of his eyes, the line of his expression, details that did not require confirmation, did not need explanation. His breath did not catch, his posture did not break, but something deeper shifted, something that did not belong to the structured world he had built, something that existed beyond strategy, beyond control. Amara did not speak. She did not explain. She did not need to. The truth stood there, quiet, undeniable, present in a way that required no words. And for the first time, Ethan Cole found himself in a moment where control was not something he could assert, adjust, or reclaim, but something he had already lost without realizing it, standing face to face with the consequence of a decision he had once believed was final. For a moment, Ethan Cole did not move, not because he could not, but because movement would have meant acknowledging something that had already taken shape in front of him, something that did not fit into any framework he had built his life around. And the room continued to breathe around them, conversations resuming in soft waves, glasses clinking faintly in the distance, the quiet hum of ambition filling the space again as if nothing had shifted, but everything had. The child's gaze lingered on him for a second longer, curious but unafraid, the kind of open attention that had not yet learned how to measure distance or consequence. And then he turned slightly toward Amara, his small hand tightening just enough against her coat to signal familiarity, trust, a connection that did not need explanation. Ethan's eyes followed that movement, not deliberately, not strategically, but instinctively, drawn to the detail in a way he had not experienced in years, because this was not data, not negotiation, not something he could analyze into submission. This was recognition, and recognition did not require confirmation. "What is his name?" Ethan asked, his voice lower than before, not carrying across the room, not meant for anyone else, just a question that existed between them, direct, unguarded in a way that surprised even him. Amara did not answer immediately. She looked at him, not searching his face, not testing his reaction, just observing, as if measuring something internal rather than external. The pause was not hesitation. It was control. "Caleb," she said finally, her voice steady, the name settling into the space between them with quiet weight. Ethan repeated it once, not out loud, but internally, the syllables aligning with something deeper than logic, something that did not require approval to exist. "Caleb." The child shifted slightly, his attention already moving on, distracted by something across the room, his world still small enough to allow for easy transitions, unaware of the gravity that had just entered the air around him. Ethan straightened subtly, the familiar structure of his posture returning, but it no longer carried the same certainty. "How long?" he asked, the question incomplete but understood, because there was only one timeline that mattered now. Only one answer that would align the reality in front of him with the absence he had been experiencing for weeks. Amara's expression did not change, but her gaze held his more firmly this time, anchoring the moment. "Long enough," she replied, not evasive, not confrontational, just precise, the kind of answer that did not offer more than what was necessary. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, measured, but heavier than it should have been, as if something within him had shifted its weight without warning. Around them, the room continued its quiet motion, but the space between them remained still, defined, separate from everything else. "You should have told me," he said, and for the first time, there was something beneath the words that was not entirely controlled, not entirely structured, something closer to realization than accusation. Amara's gaze did not waver. "You made it clear there was no space for things you did not plan," she said, her tone calm, not sharp, but firm in a way that did not invite correction. The words landed without force, but they did not need it. They carried truth, and truth did not require volume to be heard. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, the kind that came too late to alter what had already been set in motion. He looked at Caleb again, the child now focused on something else entirely, his small fingers tracing the edge of a nearby table, his attention light, unburdened. There was no calculation in that presence, no expectation, just existence. Ethan had built his life around control, around precision, around outcomes that could be predicted and managed, but this stood outside of all of it, unaffected by his systems, untouched by his decisions. "Does he know?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, less certain, the question shaped by something he was only beginning to understand. Amara's answer came without delay. "He knows who is present," she said, the distinction deliberate, her words carrying layers that did not need to be unpacked in that moment. Ethan absorbed that in silence, the meaning settling deeper than the surface, the implication clear without explanation. Presence. It was not about biology. It was not about ownership. It was about consistency, about showing up, about occupying space in a way that could not be replaced or replicated. And in that measure, Ethan knew exactly where he stood. Or rather, where he did not. A voice from across the room called Amara's name, drawing her attention briefly away, a colleague gesturing for her to join a discussion already in progress. She glanced toward them, then back at Ethan, the moment between them narrowing, preparing to close. "I have to go," she said, her tone polite, professional, the same balance she had always maintained, but now entirely on her terms. Ethan nodded once, the motion small, controlled, but carrying more weight than it should have. "We are not finished," he said, not as a demand, but as a statement, one that acknowledged the reality that this moment was only a beginning, not a conclusion. Amara studied him for a brief second, her expression unreadable, then inclined her head slightly. No, she agreed softly. We are not. There was no promise in her voice, no commitment, just acknowledgement, the kind that left the outcome undefined. She turned then, her hand resting lightly against Caleb's shoulder, guiding him with a gentle motion that required no words, and together they moved back into the flow of the room, her presence integrating seamlessly into the space she now occupied, her world continuing without pause. Ethan remained where he was, the noise of the event returning around him, conversations overlapping, laughter rising and falling, but none of it reached him in the same way. His focus stayed fixed on the path she had taken, the distance between them growing with each step she moved away, but the connection no longer defined by proximity. It was defined by something else now, something he could not control, could not restructure, could not undo. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole stood in a position where the next move was not his to dictate, where the outcome depended on something beyond strategy, beyond influence, beyond the systems he had mastered. And as he finally turned away, the weight of that realization settled fully, not as a sudden impact, but as a steady presence that would not fade, because some truths, once seen, did not disappear. They waited, and this one would not be ignored. The night did not end when the event faded. It followed Ethan Cole home in the quiet spaces between movement, in the reflection of glass doors sliding shut behind him, in the low hum of the car engine as the city lights blurred past in steady lines that should have meant clarity but now felt like distortion. He did not check his phone during the drive, did not respond to the messages that had already begun to stack, because for the first time in years, his attention was not on what needed to be handled, but on what could not be resolved with action alone. Caleb. The name repeated in his mind without effort, not as a question, not as a calculation, but as a presence that had entered his reality without permission and refused to be categorized. When he reached his building, the lobby greeted him with the same polished stillness it always had, marble floors reflecting the overhead lights, the concierge nodding with quiet recognition, everything in place, everything predictable. But predictability no longer felt like control. It felt incomplete. Inside his penthouse, the silence was absolute, the kind that amplified thought instead of calming it. Every step he took echoing slightly against the open space, every movement deliberate but without direction. He set his keys down on the counter, the soft click of metal against stone sounding louder than it should have, and for a moment he stood there, his hands resting lightly against the edge, his gaze unfocused, not looking at anything in particular, because everything that mattered was no longer in front of him. He moved through the space without intention, past the living area, past the glass walls that framed the city below, until he stopped near the window, the skyline stretching out in perfect alignment, a world he had mastered from a distance, a system he understood completely. But the clarity of that view did nothing to steady him now. Instead, it reminded him of something he had overlooked, something that had existed within his reach, and yet entirely outside his awareness. Presence. Amara's words returned with precision, not as accusation, but as definition. He knows who is present. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath controlled, but it did not release the weight settling deeper in his chest. Presence was not a strategy. It was not a decision made in a boardroom or a contract, negotiated over time. It was consistency. It was showing up when it mattered, without being asked, without being scheduled, without being calculated. And in that measure, he had not existed at all. He reached for his phone then, the motion instinctive this time, not calculated, his thumb moving across the screen until her name appeared, unchanged, still stored exactly where it had always been, as if nothing between them had shifted. For a second, he hesitated, not because he did not know what to say, but because saying anything would confirm something he had not yet fully allowed himself to accept. Then he pressed call. The line rang once, twice, the sound steady, neutral, and then it connected. Hello. Her voice came through, calm, clear, carrying no surprise, as if she had expected this moment to arrive eventually. Ethan did not speak immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to acknowledge that this was not a conversation he had prepared for. I want to see him, he said finally, the words direct, unfiltered, not wrapped in negotiation or justification, just a statement of intent. There was a pause on the other end, not long, but deliberate, controlled in the same way everything about her had always been. "That is not something you decide alone," she replied, her tone steady, not defensive, not confrontational, simply defined. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, the response expected, yet heavier than anticipated, because it placed him outside a system he had always dominated, outside the position of authority he had never questioned. "I understand that," he said, and for the first time, the words carried truth without resistance, acknowledgement without argument. Another pause, quieter this time, as if something in his tone had shifted the weight of the moment. "Then you understand that this is not about what you want," she said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "It is about what he needs." Ethan leaned back against the counter, his grip tightening slightly against the edge, not in frustration, but in grounding, anchoring himself in a reality that did not bend to his expectations. "And what does he need?" he asked, the question genuine, unguarded in a way that did not come naturally to him. Amara did not answer immediately, and when she did, her voice carried something deeper than explanation. "He needs consistency," she said. "He needs stability. He needs to know that the people in his life do not disappear when it becomes inconvenient." The words landed with quiet precision, each one aligning with something Ethan could not deny, something he recognized not just in theory, but in the absence he had created without realizing it. He did not respond right away. There was no argument to make, no counterpoint to offer, because this was not a negotiation. This was truth. "I am not asking to take anything from you," he said after a moment, his voice lower now, steadier, not asserting, not demanding, just stating what he could. "I am asking to be present." The word felt different when he said it, heavier, more defined, no longer abstract, but anchored in meaning he was only beginning to understand. On the other end, the silence shifted again, not resistant, not yielding, just considering. "That is not something you say once," she replied. "It is something you prove over time." Ethan nodded slightly, though she could not see it, the motion instinctive, the acceptance real. "Then I will prove it," he said, and this time, there was no hesitation in his voice, no calculation, just a decision that did not come from strategy, but from recognition. The line remained quiet for a second longer, and then she spoke again. "We will start small," she said. "A park. Saturday morning. 10 o'clock. The simplicity of it contrasted everything Ethan was used to. No contracts, no formalities, just a time and a place. An opportunity that did not guarantee anything beyond the moment itself. "I will be there," he said, the words immediate, certain in a way that did not require reinforcement. "I know," she replied, and then the line went still, the call ending without ceremony, without closure, just a transition into something that had not existed before. Ethan lowered the phone slowly, the quiet of the apartment settling around him once again, but it felt different now, not empty, not unresolved, but defined by something new, something that did not belong to the world he had mastered, but to one he was only beginning to enter. He turned back toward the window, the city still stretching out before him, unchanged, predictable, controlled, but his focus no longer rested there. It had shifted, narrowed, centered on a single moment set for a Saturday morning, on a presence he had never offered before, on a path that would not be measured in deals or outcomes, but in something far less tangible and far more demanding. And for the first time, Ethan Cole understood that control was not the same as connection, and that what stood in front of him now was not a system to manage, but a reality he would have to earn his place within, step by step, moment by moment, without guarantee, without shortcuts, only through the consistency he had never needed before but would now have to learn. Saturday morning arrived without urgency, but Ethan Cole was already awake before the city had fully settled into the day, the light outside his windows soft and gray, the kind that did not demand attention but slowly filled the space with quiet clarity. He stood in his kitchen longer than necessary, coffee untouched on the counter, his mind not on schedules or meetings or projections, but on something far less structured, something that did not fit into the rhythm he had built his life around. 10 o'clock. A park. The simplicity of it still felt unfamiliar, stripped of everything he usually relied on. No agenda, no defined outcome, just presence. He checked his watch again, not because he needed to, but because time felt different now, measured not in productivity, but in anticipation, and for the first time in years, he left his apartment early without filling the gap with something else. The park was already alive when he arrived, sunlight breaking through the trees in thin streaks that moved with the breeze, the sound of distant laughter and footsteps weaving through the open space. Children running across the grass with the kind of freedom that did not consider consequences or outcomes, only the moment itself. Ethan stood near the entrance for a second, his posture still composed, still carrying the structure of a man used to controlled environments, but the setting did not respond to that structure. No one adjusted their movement when he stepped forward. No one paused their conversation. The world here did not revolve around authority. It existed independently of it. He walked toward the center path, his pace steady, his eyes scanning not with calculation, but with something closer to recognition, searching without fully knowing what he was looking for. And then he saw them. Amara sat on a bench beneath a wide oak tree, her posture relaxed but grounded, her presence steady in a way that did not draw attention yet anchored the space around her. Caleb stood a few feet away, focused on something in the grass, his small hands moving with careful curiosity, completely absorbed in a world that did not extend beyond what he could see and touch. Ethan slowed slightly, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, the moment stretching as he approached, every step carrying more weight than it should have. Amara looked up before he reached them, her gaze meeting his without surprise, without tension, just acknowledgement, as if she had already accounted for his presence in the rhythm of the morning. "You are early," she said, her voice calm, neutral, not a judgment, just an observation. Ethan nodded once, his eyes shifting briefly toward Caleb before returning to her. "I did not want to be late," he replied, the words simple, but carrying intention he did not need to explain. Amara studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, then gestured lightly toward the open space near the bench. "You can sit," she said. It was not an invitation in the way he was used to, not extended with expectation, just offered as an option, something he could accept or not without altering anything else. Ethan moved forward, lowering himself onto the edge of the bench, his posture still structured, his movements measured, but the environment did not require it. It did not respond to it. For a moment, none of them spoke, the quiet filled instead by the sound of leaves shifting overhead, distant voices blending into the background, the rhythm of a morning that did not depend on conversation to exist. Caleb looked up then, his attention shifting naturally, his gaze landing on Ethan with the same curiosity he had shown at the event, but without the context that had defined that moment. Here, there were no expectations, no unspoken weight, just a new presence in his space. He studied Ethan for a second, then took a small step closer, his expression open, unguarded. Ethan did not move immediately, not because he did not want to, but because he understood, instinctively, that this was not a moment to direct, not something to control. It was something to receive. "Hi," Caleb said, his voice soft, testing the space between them, offering something without knowing what it meant. Ethan felt something shift again, subtle but undeniable, a response that did not come from habit or training, but from something deeper, something he had not needed before. "Hi," he replied, his voice quieter than usual, steady, but without the authority it usually carried. Caleb tilted his head slightly, considering him, then took another step forward, closing the distance in a way that did not ask for permission. "Do you want to see?" he asked, holding up something small in his hand, a leaf, partially torn, its edges uneven, but important to him in a way that did not require explanation. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his attention narrowing to the object, to the gesture, to the moment itself. "What is it?" he asked, not out of politeness, but genuine interest, allowing the conversation to exist on Caleb's terms. "It is broken," Caleb said, his tone matter-of-fact, not upset, just stating what he saw. Ethan looked at the leaf, then back at Caleb, the simplicity of the statement settling in a way that felt unexpectedly significant. "It still works," he said after a second, the words coming without calculation, not as a lesson, but as a reflection. Caleb considered that, his expression thoughtful in a way that felt far older than his years, then nodded slightly. accepting the idea without question, as children often did when something made sense in its own quiet way. Amara watched the exchange without interrupting, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, but there was something in the way she observed, something that measured not the words, but the intention behind them. Ethan straightened slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly, not disappearing, but shifting, adapting to a space that did not demand it. Time moved differently here, not marked by urgency or deadlines, but by moments that connected without needing structure. Caleb moved back toward the grass, his attention already shifting to something new, his world expanding and contracting in simple cycles that did not require consistency to feel complete. Ethan watched him for a second longer, then turned back to Amara, his expression more open than it had been before. "I will be here next Saturday," he said, the statement simple, but carrying more than just a plan, a commitment formed without negotiation. Amara met his gaze, her expression calm, but her eyes searching in a way that suggested she was not measuring the words, but the consistency that would follow them. "We will see," she replied, not dismissing, not confirming, just leaving space for reality to prove itself. Ethan nodded once, accepting that without resistance, because for the first time, he understood that this was not about what he said, but what he did, not about control, but about presence. And as he sat there, in a space that did not recognize his authority, that did not respond to his usual methods, he realized that this was not a system he could master quickly, not something he could accelerate or optimize. It would require time, consistency, patience, things he had never needed to rely on in this way before. But as he watched Caleb move freely through the morning light and felt the quiet steadiness of Amara beside him, he also understood something else, something that did not come from strategy, but from recognition. This was not a loss of control. It was the beginning of something that could not exist within it. The following week did not announce itself with anything dramatic, but Ethan Cole felt the difference in the way time moved, not as something to be filled, but as something to be honored, each day carrying a quiet awareness that had not existed before, each decision shaped not just by outcomes, but by a commitment he had already made without fully understanding how much it would require. Monday returned him to the glass walls, to the structured environment that had once defined him completely, but even there, something had shifted, not in the systems themselves, but in the way he moved within them. His assistant noticed it first, not in what he said, but in what he did not interrupt, the way he allowed a conversation to finish without cutting it short, the way he paused before answering instead of responding immediately, small changes that did not alter the outcome of meetings, but adjusted their tone in ways that were subtle yet undeniable. "The Larson Group has confirmed their decision," she said late that morning, her voice careful, as if anticipating a reaction that no longer came as sharply as it once had. Ethan looked up from the document in front of him, his gaze steady, his expression composed. "And," he prompted, not assuming, not filling the silence with expectation. "They have decided to move forward with another firm," she replied, the words landing clearly, without embellishment. There was a time when that would have triggered immediate recalibration, a sequence of calls, adjustments, strategies deployed to regain control of the situation before it fully settled. Now, Ethan simply nodded once, the motion deliberate, acknowledging the outcome without resistance. "Understood," he said, his tone even, not detached, but accepting in a way that felt different, less reactive, more grounded. The assistant hesitated slightly, then added, "It is a smaller firm, recently established." Ethan's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in frustration, but in recognition, a quiet connection forming between what he had lost and what was beginning to rise elsewhere. "Send me their profile," he said, his voice steady, controlled, but carrying a layer of interest that had not been there before. She nodded and stepped out, the door closing softly behind her, leaving Ethan alone with a thought he did not immediately dismiss. Across the city, Amara Brooks moved through her own week with the same measured precision she had always carried. But now every decision belonged entirely to her, every outcome tied directly to her own judgment, her own timing. Her office remained modest compared to the one she had left behind, but it no longer felt temporary, no longer felt like a transition. It felt intentional. Caleb sat near the window with a set of wooden blocks, stacking them carefully, his small hands moving with focus that mirrored something deeper, something inherited not through instruction, but through observation. Amara glanced toward him occasionally, her awareness never fully leaving him even as she worked, her presence divided but never diminished. A notification appeared on her laptop, another inquiry, another potential client, and she reviewed it with the same calm focus, her decisions no longer filtered through someone else's priorities. By Friday evening, the week had settled into a quiet rhythm, both worlds moving forward on parallel paths that had begun to intersect but not yet align. Ethan left his office earlier than usual, not because the work was done, but because something else now held equal weight in his schedule, something that could not be delegated or postponed. The drive home felt shorter this time, not because the distance had changed, but because his focus had shifted, the destination no longer defined by a place, but by a moment waiting ahead. Saturday morning came again, the lights softer, warmer, the air carrying the same calm energy as before, but this time, Ethan did not hesitate at the entrance. He walked directly toward the path, his steps steady, his awareness clearer, not searching, but knowing. Amara was already there, seated on the same bench, her posture relaxed, her presence unchanged, grounded in a way that did not require adjustment. Caleb stood nearby, this time holding a small toy car, pushing it slowly along the edge of the path, his attention fixed on the movement, the wheels turning with quiet consistency. Ethan approached without pause, his presence no longer foreign to the space, but not yet fully integrated either. "You are on time," Amara said, her voice neutral, but carrying a slight shift from the week before. Not quite approval, but recognition. "I said I would be," Ethan replied, the words simple, but this time they did not feel like a statement. They felt like a continuation. Caleb looked up again, his gaze landing on Ethan with less hesitation, the familiarity beginning to form in a way that did not require explanation. "You came back," he said, his voice light, almost surprised, but not doubtful, just noticing what had happened. Ethan felt the weight of that observation settle in a way that no boardroom question ever had. "I said I would," he repeated, this time not to Amara, but to Caleb, the meaning shifting, deepening, becoming something more than words. Caleb nodded, accepting that with the same ease he had accepted everything else, then held up the toy car. "It is fast," he said, offering it again, sharing something small but significant in his world. Ethan crouched slightly this time, lowering himself to Caleb's level without thinking about it, his attention fully present in the moment. "How fast?" he asked, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally, without structure, without expectation. Caleb pushed the car forward, the wheels rolling quickly along the pavement. "Like this," he said, his voice carrying quiet excitement. Ethan watched the movement, then looked back at him. "That is pretty fast," he replied, and the simplicity of the exchange carried more meaning than anything he had said in a meeting all week. Amara observed them again, her gaze steady, but this time there was a slight shift, something almost imperceptible, not in her expression, but in the way she allowed the moment to continue without interruption. Time moved differently again, not measured in minutes, but in interactions, in the gradual layering of presence that could not be forced or accelerated. Ethan remained longer this time, not because he was asked to, but because he chose to, allowing the rhythm of the space to guide him rather than imposing his own. When he finally stood to leave, the sun had risen higher, the park more active, the quiet morning expanding into a fuller day. "Next Saturday," he said, not as a question, but as a continuation, his voice steady, certain in a way that no longer required confirmation. Amara looked at him, her expression unchanged, but her eyes holding something deeper, something that measured not just consistency, but intention. "We will see," she replied again, but this time, the words carried a slightly different weight, not resistance, not doubt, but space for something to grow. Ethan nodded once, accepting that without hesitation, because he understood now that this was not about securing a place, but earning one, not through control, but through presence. And as he walked away, the city waiting beyond the park, the world of glass and steel ready to receive him again, he carried something with him that did not belong to that world, Something quieter, more demanding, but infinitely more real. A shift that would not show in reports or projections, but would define everything that came after. The third Saturday did not feel like a test, but Ethan Cole treated it like one anyway. Not in the way he approached negotiations or high-stakes decisions, but in the quiet discipline of showing up exactly as promised, without deviation, without excuse, the kind of consistency he had once expected from others without fully understanding what it required. The morning carried a sharper light this time, the sky clearer, the air warmer, the park already active with movement by the time he arrived, families spreading blankets across the grass, joggers passing in steady rhythm, children's voices rising and falling in bursts of energy that felt unstructured yet complete. Ethan stepped onto the path with a familiarity that had not existed 2 weeks before, his pace steady, his focus not searching, but directed, his awareness already tuned to a presence he had begun to recognize beyond sight alone. He saw them before they saw him. Amara stood near the edge of the playground area, her posture relaxed but attentive, her eyes tracking Caleb as he climbed a small set of steps leading to a slide, his movements careful but determined, each step taken with the kind of focus that made small achievements feel significant. Ethan slowed slightly as he approached, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the space that already existed between them, a space he was learning not to interrupt, but to enter with awareness. "You found us," Amara said when she noticed him, her voice calm, her tone unchanged, but there was something different beneath it, something that no longer questioned his presence, but acknowledged it as part of the pattern forming around them. "You are not difficult to find," Ethan replied, his gaze shifting briefly to Caleb, then back to her, his words simple, but carrying a quiet familiarity that had not been there before. Caleb reached the top of the slide and paused, looking down, his small hands gripping the sides as he considered the descent, his confidence balanced by caution in a way that mirrored something deeper, something instinctive. "You can do it," Amara called out, her voice steady, not pushing, not commanding, just offering assurance without pressure. Caleb looked at her, then down again, then back up, his decision forming in real time. Ethan watched the exchange, the subtle balance between encouragement and autonomy, the way she allowed him to choose without forcing the outcome. And something in that moment settled into place in his understanding, a dynamic that could not be replicated through control. Caleb pushed himself forward and slid down, his expression shifting from concentration to quiet satisfaction as he reached the bottom, landing with a small bounce before looking up again, this time toward both of them. "I did it," he said, his voice carrying pride that did not need validation but welcomed it anyway. Ethan nodded, stepping slightly closer, his presence more integrated into the moment than before. "You did," he said, the words steady, genuine, not exaggerated, just confirming what Caleb already knew. Caleb smiled briefly, then moved past them toward another part of the playground, his attention already shifting, his world expanding in small, continuous steps. Ethan remained where he was for a second, then turned slightly toward Amara, his posture less rigid now, his movements more natural within the space. "He is confident," he said, the observation simple, but carrying weight. Amara followed Caleb with her eyes, her expression calm, grounded. "He is learning," she replied, her tone measured, the distinction deliberate. Ethan considered that, the difference between being and becoming, between a fixed trait and a developing one, and he understood that this was not something static, not something that could be defined once and remain unchanged. "And you are giving him space to do that," he said, not as a question, but as recognition. Amara looked at him then, her gaze steady, assessing in a way that went beyond the surface. "Space matters," she said, "but so does knowing someone is there if you need them." The words settled between them with quiet clarity, not directed, not accusatory, but carrying a layer that did not need to be explained. Ethan nodded slowly, the meaning landing deeper this time, not as a concept, but as something he was beginning to experience. "I am here," he said, the statement simple, but different from the ones he had made before, less about declaration, more about alignment with action. Amara did not respond immediately. She watched him for a moment, then nodded once, not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging that the statement existed and would be measured over time. The morning continued in small, steady moments. Caleb moving between activities, occasionally returning with something to show, a rock, a stick, a small discovery that held importance in his world, each time offering it with the same open expectation, each time receiving a response that Ethan was learning to give without overthinking, without structuring, just present, just real. At one point, Caleb reached for Ethan's hand without hesitation, pulling him toward a set of swings, the gesture natural, uncalculated, and Ethan allowed himself to follow, the contact brief but significant in a way that bypassed logic entirely. He pushed the swing gently, the motion simple, repetitive, the sound of chains moving in rhythm blending with the surrounding noise. And for a moment, there was no analysis, no projection, just the act itself, the presence it required, the consistency it demanded. Amara watched from a short distance, her expression unreadable, but her posture relaxed in a way that suggested something had shifted, not dramatically, not completely, but enough to register. Time passed without urgency, the sun rising higher, the park filling with more activity, the quiet morning expanding into a fuller day, but none of it disrupted the space they had created, a space defined not by control, but by continuity. When it was time to leave, Caleb resisted slightly, not with frustration, but with the reluctance of someone who had not yet learned to separate from a moment he enjoyed. "We will come back," Amara said, her voice steady, reassuring without overpromising. Caleb nodded, accepting that with the same quiet trust he had shown in other moments, then looked at Ethan. "You will come too," he said, not asking, not doubting, just stating what he had begun to believe. Ethan met his gaze, the weight of that belief settling in a way that felt both grounding and demanding. "Yes," he said, the answer immediate, but this time it carried more than intention. It carried responsibility. Caleb accepted that without question, then turned back toward the path, his hand reaching for Amara's, his steps light, his focus already shifting forward. Ethan stood for a moment longer, watching them, the distance between them no longer defined by separation, but by something that connected across it, something that did not require proximity to exist. He turned then, stepping back onto the path that would lead him out of the park and back into the structured world he still occupied. But as he walked, he understood something with greater clarity than before. This was not about a single moment, not about a single promise fulfilled. It was about continuity, about showing up again and again, about building something that could not be rushed or forced. And for the first time, Ethan Cole recognized that the most valuable thing he could offer was not control, not strategy, not power, but something far simpler and far more difficult to maintain. Presence that did not fade. By the fourth Saturday, the rhythm no longer felt new, but it was not yet effortless either, and Ethan Cole understood that this space they were building did not reward comfort, it rewarded consistency, the kind that showed up even when the week behind it had demanded everything else. That week had not been quiet. Back in his office, pressure had finally taken a more visible form, not in chaos, but in expectation tightening around him. The board requesting more frequent updates, partners asking sharper questions, the subtle shift in confidence beginning to surface in ways that could not be ignored. He had lost 2 more deals, not dramatically, not publicly, but enough to create a pattern that others could see, enough for someone to mention, carefully, that newer firms were beginning to move faster, respond more precisely, operate with a kind of clarity that reminded him of something he had once taken for granted. He had read the reports, reviewed the names, and there it was again, not always at the top, not always highlighted, but present in the right places. Amara Brooks, not as an assistant, not as a support structure, but as a founder, a strategist, a presence that was no longer invisible. He had closed the file without reacting, but the recognition stayed with him, not as competition, but as confirmation of something he had already begun to understand. And yet, when Saturday morning came, none of that followed him into the park. The air was cooler this time, the sky partly clouded, a soft wind moving through the trees in a steady rhythm that carried a different kind of calm, one that did not depend on brightness to exist. Ethan arrived at the same time, his steps steady, his focus clear, and when he saw them, already there, already part of the morning, something in him settled in a way that had nothing to do with control. Caleb was sitting on the ground this time, a small notebook open in front of him, a crayon in his hand, his movements slower, more deliberate, drawing something with the kind of concentration that made the rest of the world fade around him. Amara sat beside him, one knee bent, her posture relaxed but attentive, her presence close without interrupting, the balance between guidance and independence still intact. Ethan approached without hesitation, his presence no longer foreign to the space, but not assumed either, something that still had to be earned each time. "What are you working on?" he asked, his voice low, not to disturb, but to join. Caleb looked up, his face lighting slightly with recognition, the familiarity now settled into something more natural. "It is a car," he said, holding up the notebook, the drawing simple, uneven, but clear in intention. Ethan crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to the level of the page, his attention focused fully on what Caleb was showing him. "It looks fast," he said, the observation immediate, connecting to what Caleb had shared before, building continuity without forcing it. Caleb nodded, pleased, then pointed to a shape beside the car. "That is you," he added, his tone casual, as if the decision had already been made without needing approval. Ethan paused, just for a second, the words landing in a way that no report or projection ever had, the inclusion simple but profound. "That is me," he repeated quietly, not correcting, not questioning, just accepting what had been offered. Amara watched the exchange, her gaze steady, her expression composed, but there was something deeper in the way she observed now, not just measuring consistency, but recognizing integration, the subtle shift from presence to belonging, not complete, not guaranteed, but forming. Ethan stood slowly, the movement unhurried, his posture relaxed in a way that no longer felt out of place. "Can I see more?" he asked, his attention still on Caleb, the question open, allowing the moment to extend if it wanted to. Caleb nodded quickly, flipping the page to reveal more drawings, shapes and lines that carried meaning within his world, each one explained with simple clarity, each one received without interruption. Time moved in quiet layers, the conversation expanding and contracting naturally, without structure, without agenda, just a steady exchange that built something without naming it. At one point, Caleb leaned slightly against Ethan's arm as he pointed to something on the page, the contact brief, uncalculated, and Ethan did not move away, did not adjust, he simply allowed it, his presence steady, his awareness grounded in the moment rather than analyzing it. Amara noticed, not the contact itself, but the absence of reaction, the way. Ethan remained present without turning it into something larger, without disrupting the simplicity of it, and something in her posture shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to register internally. After a while, Caleb closed the notebook, his attention shifting again, his energy moving towards something else in the park, and he stood, brushing his hands against his pants in a small, practiced motion before looking up at both of them. "I am going to run," he said, already moving before waiting for a response, his steps quick, his path unplanned but confident. Ethan watched him for a moment, then turned to Amara, his expression more open than it had been in previous weeks. "He included me," he said, the statement simple, but carrying weight he did not try to hide. Amara met his gaze, her expression calm, but her eyes thoughtful. "He includes what feels consistent," she replied, her tone measured, the words chosen carefully, not dismissing, not praising, just defining the pattern. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding settling deeper this time, not as a concept, but as something he was actively participating in. "Then I will remain consistent," he said, not as a promise, but as a continuation of what he had already begun. Amara held his gaze for a moment longer, then inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without adding to it, because words no longer held the same weight here as actions did. The morning continued with the same quiet rhythm, Caleb returning and leaving in cycles, each interaction building on the last, each moment adding something small but significant to what was forming between them. When it was time to leave, there was less resistance this time, not because Caleb wanted to go, but because he trusted that leaving did not mean absence, that the pattern would continue, that presence would return. "Next Saturday," Caleb said, looking at Ethan with the same certainty he had shown before, but now it felt less like assumption and more like expectation. Ethan met his gaze, the weight of that expectation settling fully. Next Saturday, he confirmed, the words steady, grounded in something that no longer needed reinforcement. Amara watched the exchange, her expression unchanged, but her silence carried something different now. Not distance, not caution, but space. Space for something to grow without interference, without forcing it into a defined shape too soon. As they walked away, Caleb between them, his steps light, his attention shifting forward, Ethan felt something settle into place, not as completion, but as alignment, a path that did not belong to the world he had built, but one he was now choosing to walk, not because it was efficient, not because it was strategic, but because it mattered in a way nothing else had before. And for the first time, the measure of his success was no longer defined by what he controlled, but by what he showed up for, again and again, without fail. By the fifth Saturday, the space between expectation and reality had begun to close, not completely, not perfectly, but enough for Ethan Cole to feel the difference before he even reached the park, a quiet shift in his awareness that no longer questioned whether he would be there, but focused instead on how he would show up when he arrived. The week behind him had demanded more than usual, the board pressing harder, the numbers requiring sharper adjustments, conversations becoming more direct, less patient, the kind of pressure he had once thrived under now carrying a different weight, not because he could not handle it, but because it was no longer the only thing that mattered. He had stayed late, recalibrated strategies, responded with the same precision he had built his reputation on, but he had also left on time when it counted, declined meetings that could wait, protected a window in his schedule that no longer felt optional. Saturday morning did not feel like an escape. It felt like alignment. The sky was overcast when he arrived, a soft gray stretching across the city, the air cooler, the light diffused in a way that softened everything it touched. The park moved at a slower pace, fewer people, quieter paths, the kind of morning that invited presence rather than activity. Ethan stepped onto the path with steady intention, his posture relaxed, his focus clear, and when he saw them, already there, already part of the moment, something settled in him without resistance. Amara stood near a small, open field, her hands tucked lightly into the pockets of her coat, her gaze following Caleb as he ran in uneven circles, his laughter breaking through the quiet in small bursts that carried further in the still air. Ethan approached without hesitation, his presence no longer tentative, but not assumed either, something that still required care, still required awareness. "It is quieter today," he said, his voice low, matching the tone of the morning rather than interrupting it. Amara glanced at him, her expression calm, her eyes steady. "Not everything needs to be loud to be meaningful," she replied, her tone even, the words simple but layered in a way that did not demand interpretation. Ethan nodded slightly, the statement settling into place without resistance, because he understood now that this space was not about intensity, but consistency, not about impact, but continuity. Caleb noticed him then, his movement slowing, his attention shifting, and without hesitation, he changed direction, running toward Ethan with a kind of certainty that did not exist in the beginning. "You came again," he said, his voice bright, but this time it carried no surprise, just confirmation. Ethan crouched slightly as Caleb reached him, meeting him at eye level without thinking, the movement natural now. "I said I would," he replied, the words familiar, but each time they were spoken, they carried more weight, more proof behind them. Caleb nodded, satisfied, then reached for Ethan's hand without asking. The gesture simple, unguarded, and Ethan accepted it without pause, his grip steady but gentle, his presence fully anchored in the moment. They walked together for a few steps, Caleb pulling him toward the open field, his energy leading, his focus shifting from one thing to another without pattern, without plan. Ethan followed, not directing, not adjusting, just allowing the path to unfold as it was offered. Amara watched them, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, but there was something different in the way she observed now, not measuring distance, not assessing risk, but recognizing continuity, the kind that could not be performed, only maintained. Caleb stopped suddenly, releasing Ethan's hand to pick up a small stick from the ground, examining it with quiet curiosity before holding it up. "This is strong," he said, testing its weight, its shape, the way it responded to his grip. Ethan leaned slightly closer, his attention focused. "How do you know?" he asked, allowing Caleb to define the answer. Caleb pressed the stick against the ground, applying pressure until it bent slightly, then returned to its shape. "It does not break," he said, his tone certain, his logic simple but complete. Ethan considered that, the demonstration, the conclusion, and something in it resonated beyond the moment, beyond the object itself. "That is how you know," he replied, his voice steady. The connection understood without needing to be explained. Caleb nodded, satisfied, then moved on again, the stick now part of his world, integrated without question. Time passed in the same quiet rhythm, small interactions building on each other, moments connecting without structure, without demand, just presence layered over presence until it began to feel natural rather than intentional. At one point, Caleb stumbled slightly as he ran, his foot catching uneven ground, his balance shifting for a brief second before he steadied himself, his expression unchanged, his movement continuing without interruption. Ethan reacted instinctively, stepping forward, his hand extending slightly, not to take control, but to be there if needed. Caleb did not reach for it, but he glanced up briefly, acknowledging the presence, then kept moving, his confidence intact. Ethan stepped back, his hand lowering, the moment passing without disruption, but the awareness of it remaining, the understanding that being present did not always mean intervening, that support could exist without control. Amara saw it, the movement, the restraint, the adjustment, and something in her gaze shifted again, not visibly, but internally, a recalibration of what she was witnessing, not just consistency, but understanding. When Caleb eventually returned, his energy slowing slightly, his attention settling, he moved closer to Amara, then looked back at Ethan, his expression thoughtful in a way that felt familiar now. "You stay," he said, the words simple, but this time they were not a question or a request. They were an expectation. Ethan met his gaze, the weight of that expectation clear, but no longer unfamiliar. "I stay," he replied, not as a promise for the moment, but as a statement that extended beyond it. Amara looked at him then, her eyes steady, searching not for perfection, but for alignment, and for the first time, there was no resistance in her silence, no distance in her stillness, just space, space that no longer needed to be defended as strongly, space that could begin to include rather than exclude. The morning continued, quieter than the ones before, but deeper in a way that did not require activity to sustain it, the kind of presence that settled rather than moved, that anchored rather than expanded. And as they walked back toward the path together, Caleb between them, his steps smaller now, his energy softer, Ethan understood something with greater clarity than before. This was not about proving something once. It was about becoming something over time, something steady, something that did not break under pressure, something that remained even when it was not being tested. And for the first time, he was not measuring progress by results, but by continuity, by the simple fact that he was still there, and that this time, he intended to remain. The sixth Saturday did not arrive with anticipation, it arrived with certainty, the kind that no longer questioned whether Ethan Cole would show up, but instead asked what his presence now meant within the space he had been carefully stepping into, moment by moment, without force, without shortcuts. The week behind him had shifted again, but this time, the change was not only external. In the boardroom, his voice had carried the same authority, his decisions still precise, his strategies still effective where they needed to be, but something else had begun to integrate into the way he led, something quieter, less immediate, a patience that had not existed before. He listened longer. He interrupted. Less. He allowed space for responses instead of filling silence with control. The board noticed, not in words, but in the way conversations unfolded differently, less tension, more clarity, and while the numbers had not fully recovered, the structure beneath them had begun to stabilize, not through force, but through alignment. Still, when Saturday came, none of that mattered in the way it once would have. The park greeted him with a familiar calm, the early light filtering through the trees in soft patterns that shifted with the breeze, the air carrying a quiet warmth that did not demand attention but invited it. Ethan stepped onto the path with the same steady pace, but now there was no adjustment needed, no internal recalibration. He belonged to this rhythm, not as an authority, but as a participant. He saw them near the same oak tree, the place that had become an anchor point without needing to be defined. Amara stood beside Caleb, her posture relaxed, her presence steady as always, but there was no distance in the way she acknowledged him this time, no silent boundary holding firm. Just space. Caleb saw him first, his reaction immediate, his body turning before his thoughts could catch up. "You are here," he said, his voice bright, but calm, not surprised, not testing, just confirming what had already become part of his world. Ethan nodded, his expression softer than it had ever been in any room that measured success differently. "I am here," he replied, and the words no longer felt like something he needed to prove. They felt like something he had become. Caleb ran to him without hesitation, his small arms wrapping briefly around Ethan's waist before pulling back just as quickly. The gesture natural, unguarded, and Ethan responded without pause, his hand resting lightly on Caleb's shoulder, grounding the moment without holding on to it. Amara watched, her gaze steady, but there was no longer calculation in it, no quiet assessment measuring consistency against doubt. What she saw now did not need to be questioned in the same way. Ethan stepped closer, his presence fully integrated into the space beside them, not replacing anything, not disrupting anything, just existing within it. "What are we doing today?" he asked, his voice calm, open, allowing the direction to come from them rather than shaping it himself. Caleb looked up, his expression thoughtful for a second, then pointed toward a small, open path leading deeper into the park. "We walk," he said, his tone simple, but certain, the decision made without needing discussion. Ethan glanced at Amara briefly, and she gave a small nod, not instructing, not approving, just acknowledging the choice. And so they walked. The path curved gently through the trees, the ground soft beneath their steps, the sounds of the park fading slightly as they moved further in, replaced by quieter rhythms, leaves shifting, branches creaking lightly in the breeze, the kind of environment that did not demand attention but rewarded presence. Caleb walked between them at first, his steps small but steady, his attention moving from one thing to another, pointing occasionally, asking simple questions, sharing observations that carried weight only because they mattered to him. Ethan listened, not correcting, not expanding, just receiving, allowing each moment to exist as it was offered. At one point, Caleb reached up, taking Ethan's hand again, this time without looking, without hesitation, as if the connection no longer required confirmation. Ethan accepted it just as naturally, his grip steady, his presence grounded, not thinking about the significance, just living within it. Amara walked beside them, her gaze forward, her posture calm, but there was something in the way she moved now, something that no longer held the same guarded distance. She was not watching to see if he would stay. She was walking as if he already had. They reached a small clearing where sunlight broke through the trees more fully, the ground open, the space wider, and Caleb let go, running ahead, his energy shifting again, his laughter carrying through the air in a way that felt lighter than before. Ethan stopped for a moment, watching him, the movement, the freedom, the trust embedded in it without being named. "He trusts easily," he said, his voice quiet but thoughtful. Amara stood beside him, her gaze following. Caleb, her expression unchanged, but her answer came without hesitation. "He trusts what remains," she said, her words steady, the distinction clear, and this time, Ethan did not need to think about what that meant. He understood, not fully, not completely, but enough to know that this was not about earning trust once. It was about maintaining it, protecting it, honoring it over time. He nodded slightly, the acknowledgement internal as much as external. "Then I will remain," he said, the words simple, but no longer a promise made to convince. A truth he intended to live. Amara looked at him then, her gaze steady, and for the first time, there was no distance in it, no quiet boundary holding space between them. Just recognition, not of what he had been, not of what he had done, but of what he had chosen to become. Caleb ran back toward them, his breath slightly uneven, his energy still high, and without thinking, he reached for both of them, one hand in Ethan's, one in Amara's, pulling them forward again without direction, without plan. And they followed, not because they needed to, not because it was expected, but because it was natural. The path ahead was not defined, not structured, not mapped out in the way Ethan had always required before. It curved, it shifted, it opened and narrowed without warning, but for the first time, that did not create uncertainty. It created possibility. And as they walked together, not as roles, not as positions, but as presence, Ethan understood something that no boardroom, no contract, no system had ever taught him. Control builds systems, but presence builds something that cannot be replaced. And this time, he was not building it for power.